Someone gives you 10 compliments and one offhand criticism, and a week later, the compliments have faded into a vague, pleasant blur. But the criticism is still sitting there, word for word, replaying itself at 3 in the morning. A colleague praises your work in front of the whole team, and you nod and move on. The same colleague makes one sharp comment about a typo, and you carry it home, turn it over for hours, maybe for years. You can recall the exact tone of voice someone used when they doubted you a decade ago. You cannot recall what anyone said to encourage you last month. If this sounds familiar, you have probably wondered what is wrong with your memory. Nothing is wrong with it. It is working exactly as it was built to. Today, I want to show you why your brain treats insults and compliments so differently, and why this has almost nothing to do with self-esteem and everything to do with survival. The first thing to understand is that this is not a personal flaw. Psychologists have a name for it: negativity bias. It describes a well-documented pattern in which negative experiences, negative information, and negative feedback have a stronger and longer-lasting impact on the mind than positive experiences of equal intensity. Researchers who have studied this extensively describe it with a simple phrase: bad is stronger than good. Not slightly stronger, measurably, consistently stronger across memory, attention, and emotion. This is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. For most of human history, missing a compliment cost you nothing. Missing a threat could cost you everything. A brain that weighted praise and danger equally would have been a brain that did not survive very long. So the nervous system evolved to flag negative information as urgent and worth storing in detail, while positive information gets filed away as pleasant but non-essential. The insult gets a permanent room in memory. The compliment gets a few minutes on the porch before it is asked to leave. But evolution only explains why the bias exists in general. It does not explain why some people experience it far more intensely than others. Why one person can hear a harsh comment and let it pass through them, while another person replays it for a decade. That difference usually comes down to something layered on top of the basic bias. How a person learned, early on, to interpret criticism as information about their fundamental worth. For some people, this came from an environment where criticism was rare but devastating when it arrived, where a parent's disappointment was so emotionally loud that a single sharp comment outweighed months of ordinary affection. For others, it came from growing up in conditions where approval felt unreliable or conditional. So the brain learned to treat every negative signal as urgent evidence that might finally explain why love or safety could be withdrawn. In both cases, the nervous system was trained to scan for threat in the form of disapproval, and to store that threat in high resolution, because at some point, missing it actually had consequences. This is also where rumination comes in. Insults tend to trigger repetitive, analytical thinking. The mind circling back again and again, trying to extract a lesson, trying to prevent it from happening again. Compliments rarely trigger that same loop, because there is nothing to defend against. You do not need to analyze safety. You only need to analyze threat. So the insult gets reinforced every time you replay it, while the compliment, never replayed, simply fades on schedule. Here is what most people do not realize about this asymmetry. Over time, it does not just distort your memory, it distorts your self-concept. If you store every criticism in vivid detail and let every compliment evaporate, the evidence you have on file about yourself becomes wildly unbalanced, not because the criticism was more accurate, but because it was simply louder and stored more efficiently. You end up building a self-image out of a biased sample, and then mistaking that sample for the full picture of who you are. There is also a relational cost. People who weight criticism this heavily often become hyper-vigilant in relationships, scanning new interactions for the next piece of negative feedback, bracing for disapproval, sometimes withdrawing from feedback altogether because even constructive criticism feels disproportionately threatening. And ironically, the more a person tries to avoid all future criticism, the less they tend to take risks, share opinions, or put new work into the world, which means fewer compliments are even generated to balance the scale. So how do you recalibrate a bias this deeply wired? You cannot delete it. It evolved for a reason, and it is not going anywhere. But you can train yourself to compensate for it. The first practice is deliberate retention. Compliments fade fast, specifically because the brain treats them as low priority. So you have to manually override that. When someone says something genuinely kind or affirming, pause for 10 seconds and let it actually register, the way you would automatically register an insult. Write it down if you need to. The bias will not do this work for you. The second practice is proportional weighting. When a piece of criticism lands, ask yourself a simple question. How many people, across how much time, would need to say the opposite for this one comment to be representative of the truth? Usually, the answer reveals how disproportionate the weight you are giving it actually is. And the third practice is noticing the loop. When you catch yourself replaying an insult for the 5th or 6th time, recognize that the rumination itself is the bias in action, not a sign that the original comment deserves this much attention. The loop is not analysis. It is an alarm that has not been told to stand down. Here is what I want you to take from this. If you can recite every harsh word ever said to you, but cannot remember the kind ones from last week, it is not because the harsh words were more true. It is because your brain was built by a process that prioritized danger over comfort, and it has been doing its job a little too well. You are allowed to let an old insult lose its weight. You are allowed to let a compliment stay a little longer than 10 seconds. The criticism does not get to be the only thing on file. Leave a comment below. Which one are you still carrying? An insult from years ago or a compliment? I want to hear from you. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if this resonated, and I will see you in the next one.